Jane Peyton, welcome to the show.
Hello, Jacob. Thanks for inviting me on. Good to be here.
What made you so interested in the history of alcohol? Where did it all begin for you?
Well, it began for me with a character called Ina Sharples, who was on Coronation Street. And as a child, sometimes watch Coronation Street, the soap opera, and she would always be in the pub drinking milk stout with her friends, and they'd be sitting there pouring from a bottle into the glass. And she just seemed to be having fun. They were gossiping, they were catching up, but they were being sociable. And I just liked the look of it. I liked the look of pubs and I liked the look of what was in that glass. And so when I got a little bit older and could go to pubs, I always remembered Ina Sharples. She started me off. And then I write books and write magazine articles, and I'm interested in history. And when I discovered about the history of alcoholic drinks and the way that it's been so important to humans for thousands of years, for millennia, then I got really interested in it and I wanted to learn more about it. So that was it. And then, very importantly, because I am a beer drinker, by the way, but I do drink other alcoholic drinks, but beer would be my primary drink. And I discovered that women were the original brewers. And I wanted to know why. Why would that be? And then I discovered because beer is food, it's made out of foodstuffs, as all alcoholic drinks are, by the way. And food was the domain of women, so food preparation. So that made me want to know even more. So it really started there. So thank you, Ina Sharples, for taking me on this very, very long and very interesting trip around the history of alcohol.
So, when did women stop kind of being stereotypically known for not drinking? When did men start being more known for drinking beer than women if women started it?
Yes. Um, I mean, I would say that it's very recently, actually. I would say it's probably from about the 1960s into the 70s when large global brewing corporations started marketing pale lagers. So the most popular style of beer in the world is a version of a pale lager. It's Heineken and Stella and Carling, all those sorts of really well-known brands. And they started marketing at young men. And some of the adverts were quite blokey, actually, and they seemed to sideline women as beer drinkers. So I think it started from then in a really quite dramatic way. Um, it had started slightly earlier than that, in that some of the ale houses and the pubs were a bit rowdy. You know, there were particularly rowdy places where women weren't welcome, actually. There were male places, and I'm going back a few hundred years now. Really, something happened, actually, and this is quite extraordinary. So women's role in brewing, in Britain anyway, for sure, and maybe in parts of Europe as well, the Black Death had a big impact on this. And you might think, oh, why is that then? And so many people died during the Black Death that the people who were left to do all the work, you know, the peasants and the farm workers and the manual workers, they could ask for more money for their wages. And because there wasn't anybody else to do the work. And so the owners of the companies or the farms, the landowners would have to pay those wages. So suddenly people had more disposable income. And what do you want to do when you've got disposable income? You want to go to an ale house or somewhere and have beer or get together with your friends. And so the demand for beer increased because there was more disposable income. And so beer stopped being majority made in houses, in kitchens of women, and started to be made in purposely built structures called breweries. So this is from the medieval period, and women didn't tend to work outside of the home. And so beer was being made in more volume in purposely built buildings, breweries. And so women were slightly sidelined from that. So it was a slow process, but I would say that the Black Death had a big thing to do, big impact on it, and that was the mid 14th century.
Wow. Okay. That's really, really interesting. I had no idea that something like the Black Death would have anything
Oh,
to
it's
do with
incredible,
that.
isn't it? And the
Yeah.
Black Death wasn't just in Britain or England, it was everywhere in Europe. So the beer making countries in Europe might have had a similar experience as we did in Britain. Something else as well is that from the medieval period, England as it was, because Britain didn't exist, but England as it was started fighting more wars. There was war with Scotland, there was always war with France. And then later on, there was wars with Spain and not Portugal. That was our ally. But there were always wars in continental Europe and Scotland and England. And the soldiers needed beer. So they drank beer. It was known as ale in those days. So they drank lots of ale. So they needed a regular supply that could supply in volume. And that was another reason why beer, ale as it was then, started to be made in breweries to supply this big volume and demand.
Has there ever been a period in history where beer's been drank more than like water has?
Until about the mid-19th century, the tax on tea was really high, and most people couldn't afford tea. And that sounds really odd now because it's one of our national drinks. It's inexpensive comparatively to other things, and it's part of our life. It's an absolute fundamental of our lives, isn't it? But until the 19th century, people on low incomes couldn't afford tea. It was a luxury item. And so what did they drink instead? They tended to drink ale. They couldn't afford coffee either, by the way, because coffee tax was high. And there weren't many options for something refreshing to drink. So there wasn't refrigeration, so you couldn't drink milk, and milk isn't actually refreshing, is it? You wouldn't drink fruit juice. If you lived in a city or an urban area, you didn't have access to that. And so ale was everywhere, and ale is up to 95% water, beer, beer ale. And so people would drink beer and ale as a refreshment. But then because they had no other options, but then when the tax on tea was reduced, then suddenly it was inexpensive. And the sales of beer went down in the 19th century because more people were drinking tea because they had access to it and could afford it. They didn't need to rely on ale anymore, beer. So that was quite recently, mid-19th century. The person who persuaded the Prime Minister was Mr. Twining, and Twinings are still one of the main tea-making companies worldwide, actually, now.
Oh, yeah.
Well-known global brand, Twinings. And
Wow.
it was Mr. Twining who persuaded the government.
I have heard something. I can't remember where I heard this when I was younger, but apparently beer also used to be drank because the water wasn't very sanitated, and because beer had ethanol in it, it kind of was more safe to drink. Is that true, or is that a myth?
It's not a myth. It is true in some places. Even now, in some parts of the world where water is not trustworthy, people will drink beer. People did drink water in some parts of the world and the country, in this country as well. But they also drank beer. The thing was that, until modern science, you don't know what's in the water. Even now, we don't know what's in the water.
Yeah.
And so you can understand why people would drink something that they could trust. To make beer, you boil it. The alcohol is a sterilant as well. And so drinking something, any alcoholic drink actually, not just water, although beer's better because it is mostly water. But it is, if you don't trust the water, then your alcoholic drink is a more safe option. But beer would be much better because it's mostly water and it's full of nutrition as well.
So we're talking quite a lot about beer. How prevalent was wine and like spirits throughout history, and especially in Britain? Was it mainly just everyone was drinking beer, or was there a lot of access to wine and other spirits as well?
Yes. Wine was a status symbol. It was a luxury item. And in some parts of the world, in Europe in particular, and Britain as well, there were things called sumptuary laws, which meant that only certain people could wear particular outfits or fur or fabrics, but also they could drink certain things as well. Wine also would have been higher. It was a high status drink and had been throughout history, actually. But it would have been more expensive than ale was. It wouldn't have been as accessible to find it. I mean, with ale and beer, you could just go to, the ale houses, pubs, easily accessible, whereas wine was less accessible for a lower class of person or a person without as much money. But yes, wine was around if you had the money and the wherewithal for it. Spirits, distilled spirits, didn't come into the drink spectrum until probably the 14th century, and they were actually medicine. So when people talk about just what the doctor ordered, having an alcoholic drink, spirits were actually delivery methods for medicinal herbs and spices. Because the medicinal herbs and spices, the active ingredient would dissolve in alcohol, but it wouldn't dissolve in water. So a way of getting your medicine basically was to have alcohol with it. So there weren't recreational drinks until people started to realize, actually, having the wine distilled into brandy with our medicinal herbs and spices, quite good because we get intoxicated, we get a buzz out of it. So there was this dual use for spirit that was for medicine, but it was also for recreation. And then probably from about the 16th, 17th century, really they were just for recreation. So in this country, there was something called the gin frenzy or the gin craze. It started in the late 17th century and went for about 150 years in Britain, where gin was encouraged. And the reason for that is because the person who introduced gin into this country was a Dutch prince called William of Orange. And the national drink of his part of the world was a drink called Genever, which is spelled Genever, which is where the word gin comes from. And it's a distilled spirit with juniper as its main ingredient. So that became really popular in Britain, gin, as it became known as. And it could be made anywhere. Like you just had to buy a really cheap license and anybody could make gin. And it was a terrible scourge on society because gin was really cheap and it was inexpensive, but it was really poor quality. The distilling technology wasn't very high quality. Also, the strength of the gin was really high in alcohol. So you're talking 60, 80%.
Wow.
Nowadays, it's 38 or 40%. And poor quality, really high alcohol. And so people who were in a lower class, gin was the drink of the lower class, by the way, which is ironic because nowadays it's the other way. It tends to be more of a like, oh, I'm drinking gin and tonic, and it has a more high status reputation. But it got you where you wanted to go quickly, gin did. If it was 60 and 80 more percent alcohol, and where you wanted to go was to be completely out of it. You wanted to be intoxicated because you lived a horrible life. You lived in a slum. Like terrible lifestyle, or because you were poor. And so gin was a really cheap escape. And so this terrible scourge on society, destroyed the underclass for 150 years or so. Eventually It petered out after lots of government intervention trying to ban gin or trying to price it out of the market. It was just very, very tricky. Yeah.
What other crazes have there been for certain drinks in history, if any, that you're aware of?
Gin would probably be the main thing, actually, in terms of its impact on society. I'd say that was, if you were saying, a craze and something that had a really massive impact on society outside of it just being something that you got intoxicated by, it had such a knock-on effect, the gin did. So it was major.
Yeah.
It was mostly in cities, by the way. So it wouldn't have been in villages or the rural parts of the country. It was in cities, industrial cities or port cities, London, Liverpool, Portsmouth, places where there was a big underclass of people. There were slums and there were lots of poverty, and access to gin as well. So you wouldn't necessarily get that in the rural parts of the country.
Yeah. So you said that spirits had kind of like a dual purpose in the sense that they were also used for medicinal purposes. What was the origin use of beer? Was it just to get drunk? We spoke about kind of sanitation, but I'm just wondering if beer or wine also had any other uses.
Beer would have been, beer goes back thousands of years, by the way. So thousands and thousands of years ago, it evolved by accident. So historians believe that the grains that make the beer in warm weather, and I'm now talking about the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East, this is where it would have happened. That part of the world is called the Fertile Crescent. It's also where agriculture started as well. So the grain that was being grown might have germinated in warm weather. It might have got a bit damp and germinated. And by germinating, the starch in the seeds is converted to sugars. And wild yeast in the air can convert those sugars and eat them and convert them to alcohol. So somehow, just by trial and error, and nobody knows where or who or when, it would have been discovered that a liquid with this cereal in it, germinated cereal, gave you this gentle buzz. Now, that grain was food, by the way. So your food was magically, supernaturally giving you this this buzz. And so when humans worked out what was happening and how to do that, they could replicate it and start making it at home. So that's what they did. And it was a lovely side effect that they got a little intoxicated by it. Now, the conversion of food to something intoxicating was considered to be supernatural. And so it was connected to the deities. And in those days, there were pagan deities. And so you would worship your deity by drinking this magical libation. And there was no shame in getting drunk. In fact, it was encouraged. It was a way of worshipping your deity, to be drunk and go to big festivals and have a right hootenanny, get really out of it and enjoy yourself. So that was wine. That was beer. Also, beer is water. So again, it's food. Wine was always a more high status thing, and it was drunk to intoxicate people for sure. But it was drunk in a different way. So it was drunk by people with money or status, and they might drink it as they were doing governmental things. For instance, Persians, they would get drunk and they'd talk about whatever the government was going to do, or the rulers were going to do, the king or whoever the rulers were. And they'd come up with these ideas. And then the next day they would discuss those ideas when they were sober. And if they still had the same idea about the same opinion about the idea, then it would go into law, or it would be adopted as a regulation. So there would with alcohol, there was different uses for it, not just, it's delicious, it tastes great, but it could be part of statecraft. Also, because alcohol bonds us, we become very friendly when we drink alcohol and get slightly intoxicated. So alcohol has always been a way of bonding people, which was really good for tribes that might be enemies or warring against each other. And if you sit down and have a drink with an enemy, you often become friends, or you start talking at least and maybe discuss things. So it was used for that. It was used for worshipping your deity, for statecraft, for bonding with people, for making communities together. Same now, you go to the pub here in a village, and if you've just moved into that village, you don't know anybody. So you go to the pub, you have a drink, you get to know people, you get chatting, because over a little drinky, but you can still do this with non-alcohol versions of drinks as well. In that social situation, you start making friends with people and you do build some friendships. So throughout history, alcohol has had this purpose that's more than just a recreational drink. It's had a practical purpose as well. Plus, it's good for you in moderation, and it's been medicine as well.
Why does it make us more sociable? Do you know the reasons?
Yes, it's because the alcohol changes our brain chemistry, and it gives us endorphins, and it stimulates an area in the brain that's the pleasure part of the brain. And it also loosens us up, and it makes us less inhibited, and it makes us happy in moderation. Now, if you have too much of it, it has the opposite effect. So in moderation, you get happy, you get friendly, and you want to chat with people. And it's all to do with this reward part of your brain. It does have a chemical effect. There's a theory that humans are hardwired to seek intoxication, by the way, that it's a drive, that it's a human drive to be seeking intoxication. Now, that intoxication doesn't have to be just alcohol. It can be caffeine, it can be love, sex, religion, dancing, singing. What else would do it as well? Playing an instrument, that sort of thing. So you can become intoxicated. Drugs, intoxicating drugs, magic mushrooms, weed, things like that. You have an altered state, basically, and some anthropologists reckon that humans are hardwired for it, which is why banning alcoholic drinks or drugs, in fact, don't work. It's like if you tried to ban sex, it wouldn't work. Humans will seek out ways to lose themselves in whatever way they choose.
Why do we do that? Why do we have such a kind of attraction to altering our state of mind? Is it because we're just naturally self-conscious?
Don't know, actually, but that's a good point. I think it could be because it gives us pleasure. We get pleasure. It's about this reward part of the brain. When we sing together, we come together in unity, and it's really good. It makes us feel happy. It gives us endorphins. So it's all about brain chemistry. Sex makes us feel really good. It's all about reward and the OxyContin. Hang on, I always get mixed up. There's oxytocin. Anyway.
Oxytocin, I think it is, the love hormone, isn't it?
Yes, because OxyContin is that horrible opioid, isn't it?
Yes.
So, yes, love hormones, so things like that. It makes us feel really, really good. And so we want to do it again. So it's probably related to that.
Do you think it's also maybe peace from mind, in the sense that not just alcohol, but like you said, singing, you're not really thinking about yourself. You're kind of thinking about the situation you're in. You're thinking about what you're doing. You're thinking about other people. Do you think a reason why we love things like alcohol and chase pleasure is to just kind of have that peace from our own minds?
It could be. I mean, I think people might not be aware that that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
But it could be a benefit or a side effect. So, yeah, I mean, sure, that could be it. Yeah.
What's one surprising fact about alcohol that most people don't know?
That if you drink alcohol, so alcohol's made from food, so beer from grain, cider from apples, wine from grapes, mead is made from honey, and they're all fermented. And that food goes through a process called biological ennoblement. And that means that by fermenting it, the nutritional value is increased. So drinking the alcoholic version of the food that's been fermented is much more nutritious than if you ate it. And it's also soluble as well. And it's good for you in moderation. It's all about moderation. So I did make some notes earlier, so I'm just going to refer to my notes, because you asked me that lovely question about the surprising thing. I think, biological ennoblement, and also the fact that the fourth drive, this thing that humans are hardwired for intoxication. Also that women were the original brewers. I found that absolutely fascinating. So, they're the ones I would say that really surprise people.
I mean, I think everything you've said surprised me so far, to be fair. So, yeah. Is there any kind of myths about alcohol that most people believe that is definitely not true?
Yeah. Actually, it's about beer. Again, I'm not just going to focus on beer. The myth that India Pale Ale, IPA, was a beer that was invented to be sold in India and soldiers drank it. That's a myth. So the truth is that the beer already existed as a style, but it wasn't called India Pale Ale. It was first brewed in the early to mid 18th century. It was known as either October beer, October ale, or October wine. So it was a pale beer that had quite a lot of alcohol in it, maybe 8% possibly, and there were lots of hops in it. And it just so happened that the brewer, or one of the brewers near the East India Dock in London, brewed that style of beer, and ships carried beer because beer is a source of drinking water, but it's also recreational drink for your sailors, and it's ballast for an empty ship that's going out to the Indies, the East Indies, to trade with Britain. And it's something to trade when you get there as well. And so ships would carry beer for several reasons. So that this guy at the East India Dock, where all the ships were going to the East Indies, was brewing October beer. And so some of it found its way to India, or the subcontinent of India, and became very popular with the high status people of the East India Company. Not the soldiers who lived there. They drank porter, which is a style of beer that was inexpensive, whereas this new October beer was expensive in comparison. So the soldiers never drank it, not at the beginning anyway. So several decades later, it was rebranded as East India Pale Ale. And so the fact was, it wasn't invented specifically to go to India, but there's a lot on the internet that would claim that, but that's not true.
Oh, okay. So what's the difference between Indian Pale Ale and normal Pale Ale?
So India Pale Ale is a style of beer better known as IPA. And there isn't any difference anymore since the craft beer revolution. There used to be, but there isn't now. There's this real crossover of what different styles are with IPA. And pale ales tend to be a little lower in alcohol than an IPA, but it just depends who's brewing it. IPA, I think, is quite a difficult style because it isn't one style anymore. There are several sub-styles. There are, like more than several. And new sub-styles keep being developed all the time. So it's a really tricky beer to describe. Some IPAs are very bitter. West Coast IPAs, bitter. East Coast IPAs and New England IPAs, no bitterness at all. Some are sour, some are black. It's this really very varied style of beer now. It's a collection of beers, really, IPA is now, rather than one style.
Is it kind of like branding then? They kind of just brand it as IPA. It's not a specific taste or a specific thing. It's branding it, but it's also that there are these sub-styles now that as long as the dominant flavour in your beer is hops, and because it doesn't have to be pale anymore because they're black IPAs. As long as hops are the dominant ingredient, then it falls into the category of pale ale IPA. Pale ale, by the way, I'll just go back to history a little bit. Yeah.
So when IPAs, India Pale Ales, became very popular in Britain, in India and in Britain as well. And so brewers decided they would start to brew lower alcohol versions of India Pale Ale, sell to the domestic market. And so at the time, India Pale Ale was a caramel-coloured beer. It was sort of a light brown-coloured beer because one of the ingredients of the malt, the crystal malt it's called. And so it was sold into pubs. And what the fellas and the women in the pubs would go, oh, I'll have the bitter one. Because in comparison to the other beers that were popular at the time, which was porter, stout. Ask me about stout and porter, by the way, because and mild. They were the darker beers, and they weren't very bitter in flavour. And so people would ask for the bitter one to differentiate it from the India Pale Ale, which was known as Pale Ale in Britain. So the nickname bitter stuck. So when you go to the pub in Britain and you see a pint of bitter, London Pride or what else, Timothy Taylor's Landlord, you say, oh, I'll have a pint of bitter, please. That is actually a pale ale because that's the style of beer that was the domestic version of IPA in the 19th century. And if you get a bottle of Timothy Taylor Landlord bottle, it will say pale ale on the bottle. So that's going to be the nerd.
It's an expert, not a nerd.
Quite a lot, actually.
Yeah.
So, so that. Do you want me to tell you about stouts and porters?
Yes, yeah, please. Tell me about stout and porter, yeah.
So porter is a dark beer. And it evolved from a style of beer called London Brown Ale, and it evolved in the 18th century. And around that time, by the way, porter is always a dark beer, so it's got flavours of coffee and chocolate and molasses and roastiness, always dark. But at the time, a description of strong beers that were like big and hefty was stout. So if you had a pale ale that was like high in alcohol and big body and, you know, was an assertive beer, you would call it a stout pale ale. And you got stout porters. So stout porter was the stronger version of a porter. So there were different versions. Even now, actually, you know, you get ordinary bitter, you get best bitter, you get extra special bitter. That's to do with alcohol level. And because alcohol is a flavour enhancer, you get more flavour, you get more oomph to your beer if you have more alcohol in it. So stout was just a term used for big and strong. And then when porter started to be exported to Ireland, by the way, to Dublin, before Guinness existed, so it was called stout porter, London stout porter, actually. And so Arthur Guinness, brewer in the late 18th century, started brewing a version of London stout porter, and he slightly changed the ingredients. He put a unmalted roasted barley into his brew, along with other malts as well. And that's how Guinness came about, as this dry Irish style of beer. And then they dropped the port a bit and they just called it stout. So most people now think that stout is a dark beer, and it is a dark beer, but you can also get pale stouts. And I've drunk pale stouts. They taste a bit more like barley wines, actually, which is strong in alcohol and quite fruity on the palate, dried fruit, and pale in colour, sort of copper colour, that sort of thing. So that's a story about stout that evolved from another beer. A lot of beers evolved actually from other things as well.
So it's almost like an evolution.
Evolution, exactly, yeah.
So why is Guinness so dark? What makes it have that kind of characteristic?
Yes. So the colour of beer comes from the colour of the malt that you use. Malt is the word that is used to describe the cereal, usually barley, that's gone through a process called malting. And what the malting process does is to change starch to sugars, or usable sugars for the brewer. And this happens in a malting company. And the malting process also heats the malt. And depending on the amount of temperature that you put on your malt, it changes the colour and the flavour. And so a pale ale, like if you had, I don't know, people might have had Beavertown neck oil, for instance. That uses a very pale malt. The Heinekens, the Stellas, all those pale lagers, very pale malt. So you get pale colour, because the colour of your beer comes from the colour of the malt. Pale colour in those sort of bready, biscuity flavours. Now, if you've roasted your barley, or if you've nuked it, or if it's really been heavily heated, then it changes not only the colour, but also the flavours. So the darker the malt, the darker the beer, but also the flavours. So with those dark malts, that's where you get the coffee, the chocolate, the treacle, the molasses, those burn characteristics, charcoal sometimes, tobacco. And that comes from your malt. So that's why Guinness is such a dark colour. It uses lots and lots of dark malts, and it uses an unmalted barley, which is roasted rather than malted as well. And that gives you that dry, astringent character that you get with Guinness.
Oh, nice. I read somewhere that Britain, for the first time, now has under 100,000 pubs for the first time in ages. Is that still the case?
It is, unfortunately. I think there's probably around 40,000 now.
Wow.
I don't like to see pubs close. However, this makes me a bit unpopular when I say this. We have so many pubs because most pubs that we have now evolved in the 19th or were established in the 19th century. And in the 1830s, there was a law which was to try and stop people drinking so much gin, by the way. And so the government had this law called the Beer House Act, where any ratepayer could buy a license and open a pub. That's all you needed to do. And the license was really inexpensive. You open your pub, but you had to be selling beer. So this was a way of the more benign drink, people to drink it. And so that's why we have so many 19th century pubs. They date from this period. So anybody could open a pub as long as you were a ratepayer. But also that period, it was a different country. We lived in an industrial country. We had lots and lots of heavy industry. There was mining. There was all sorts of jobs that needed, you worked in a foundry or a forge or something that was hot and bothered, and you're like, oh my goodness, after work you need to go and drink some beer to cool you down. Nowadays, we don't have that heavy industry, and people don't go down the mines as much as they used to. More people work in offices or in less manual labour now. And so the need for beer has gone as much as it was in the 19th century. Plus, we have more options for refreshment, tea, carbonated water. You don't have to be drinking beer to cool yourself down anymore. Also, nutrition's much better. So you eat food's less expensive. So you eat food rather than just drink. Men nowadays, who would go to the pubs in the 19th century and drink all the beer, men nowadays, probably in the last 30 or 40 years, it's more likely that men will go home after work and read the children a bedtime story, or they might give them a bath, or they want to be there for when the children are going to bed. They want to have dinner, supper with the family. They don't want to spend all night at the pub, but that's what men used to do. So the pub was the centre of everything. Now men and women, they've got more options of entertainment. They can go to the theatre, the cinema, they go for a run after work. They can go for dinner. They can do all sorts of things. There isn't just the pub. So the pubs that we have now, our lives have changed. Demographics have changed. Also, the ownership of pubs is very complicated in Britain. And some of the ownership models don't reward the leaseholders for doing really well and making profit, because what the owner of the lease will then do, or the owner of the property, they'll increase the rent, or they make it really difficult for those leaseholders to run pubs. So a lot of pubs have gone out of business for several reasons, some of them that I've just addressed previously. The pandemic had a big impact. Yeah. Tax on beer is really high. Tax on everything, actually, in pubs is really high. So that prevents people from going as regularly to the pub because they can't afford it anymore. Cost of living, all sorts of things, reasons not to go to the pub. And that's one of the reasons why more pubs are closing. Plus, in urban centres, I live in Brighton, there are loads and loads of pubs. But you can see where the pubs have closed, because they're now either convenience stores. This is everywhere, not just Brighton, by the way. Any urban area, you'll see where the pubs used to be, and the flats, or their convenience stores, or they've got another purpose because they're on corners, they're in high footfall areas. We have had too many pubs in this country for the market to support them all. And so really people, pubs are closing for several reasons. It's really sad, though, I think, when you see a pub closed.
Yeah.
However, saying that, in some parts of the country, mostly urban actually, if somebody is running an independent pub and they've got an amazing beer selection, they've got independent beers, they've got independent ciders and gin and wine, they've got a really good, well-curated offering of drinks, then they will get the people coming and supporting them. So it depends who is running the pub, what the business model is, and what the offering is, and where you are.
So did the pubs that tend to be more like traditional, are they the ones that are closing down and the ones that are able to adapt to new trends and demands for different things, like you said about like a different variety of drinks and stuff? Will they probably be able to survive?
Yeah. Yes, the ones that tend to close are owned by big corporations who have very strict rules and regulations on what the publican, the license holder or the leaseholder, what they can sell, where they can buy it from. And if that pub owner, big corporations, sometimes they're breweries, sometimes they're pub companies, if there are lots of the pubs owned by the same corporation, then what you're going to get to drink is the same in every single pub. So if you're in a big urban area and there's loads of pubs owned by that company, you're just going to get the same offering. So why would you go to that pub or that one? It's there's no choice. So the independents, if there is an affluent customer base who can afford to go to pubs and want that type of offering, they're the ones who will manage to survive.
Is there?
I love
But
pubs.
yeah, no, I love them as well. They're amazing. That brings me to the next question, which is what are the potential cultural impacts on this decline? What do we lose if the pubs continue to keep declining at the rate they are?
People who live in smaller urban areas and villages will lose more than the people in bigger cities, because there will still be pubs in cities. What we lose, particularly in small urban areas or villages, is a centre, a heart of the village. I'm from North Yorkshire originally, and I'm really fortunate in that the village where my family are, there are two pubs that are viable and that are really well supported. It's a really small village, by the way, so it's unusual that a small village could support two pubs. I mean, there are a lot of tourists. It's the Yorkshire Dales, and so you do get some tourists who support the pubs as well as the locals. But they are the heart of the community. That's where the community, the residents, go to socialise and to find out the news and to just have a good time
Yeah.
and meet the friends. So that's what we lose. Also, socialising is really important for mental health. And so people who lose their pubs then don't have anywhere to socialise. And so the mental health might suffer. They become lonely, or they miss out on that sort of really great vibe that you get when you're socialising, which is so good for your mental health. Mental health has an impact on physical health as well. Oxford University did a study a few years ago, and they discovered that going to the pub and having a drink, and it doesn't have to be alcoholic, by the way, but just going there and being with people and socialising was good for the mental health, and therefore it's good for physical health. And that's Oxford University.
Hmm.
And, they're not just like saying it. There are, there's proof. So they've
Yeah.
really researched it. So that's what we lose. We lose our heritage as well. Britain is a nation of pubs. It's where we used to socialise all the time because they're communal spaces. There was a writer he was a French writer, but he lived in Britain. He was an Anglophile. He was called Hilaire Belloc, and he wrote stories in the 1920s. And he has a really well-known quotation, which is something along the lines of, when you've lost your pubs, he's talking about England or Britain. In Britain, when you've lost your pubs, you've lost the sense of yourself. I'm paraphrasing it. But basically, he was saying that British people, we identify as pub goers. And when we lose them, who are we? That's what he was
Hmm.
basically saying.
Well, just think about the amount of people that go out on Friday and Saturdays, and where do they go? They go to a pub. When I go on dog walks with my family, where do we go afterwards? It's to a pub. It's just a thing to do afterwards. I feel like if we didn't have that, we would definitely lose a lot of our cultural heritage, like you said. Do you think that the increase in digital technology and social media has affected the pub's kind of livelihoods? Because like if this was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we'd be speaking probably together in a pub, well, having this conversation. But because of the digital era, we're able to do it remotely. Do you think that's had an effect as well?
I think it has, particularly in a generation of your age generation, Jacob, in that you are digital natives, and a lot of socializing for your generation happens online. Also, there are fewer people drinking alcohol in what are you? Are you Gen Z or Gen? I get mixed up, I
Oh,
forget. But anyway, Gen Z
I searched this
and
last
your
week. I searched it last
generation.
week and I can't remember. It's Gen Z or Gen X. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's Gen X. I think that may be a bit older. Anywho, so your generation is drinking less alcohol. So therefore, they're not going to the pub as much. They might go to a coffee shop, or they might just hang out in I don't know, a gaming parlor or something like that. So not going to the pub is a big issue. And drinking alcohol is a big issue as well, which is why so many brands are now bringing out non-alcoholic versions of their alcoholic drinks, by the way, just to try and get people still buying their brands. Yeah, I mean, like socializing online and not naturally just going to the pub, it's future. We need to bring people back to the pub. I mean, you say that people still go to the pub at the weekend, and I'm in a city where there are loads of students, and students do go to pubs, actually. You still see a lot of students going into pubs, but it's whether the younger, the Gen Zs and the younger ones will think, oh, I'd like to go to the pub. I think the pubs will probably have to make some alterations to adapt to those demands from that generation and that market. As long as it's always social life that's at the heart of it, and it always will be in pubs, but that must be absolutely stressed by publicans. So they might need to have games that those younger people want, or things to bring them in that aren't necessarily just about standing there with a glass in your hand, doing other things as well as drinking.
I think a reason why I go to the pub sometimes is to watch something like a football match. I feel like that will still have quite a big pull on the younger generations, especially in Britain. So I think that's kind of a beacon of hope for pubs. A lot of pubs where I'm currently living in Falmouth, they're kind of like they've adapted quite well in terms of like doing things to entice young people. So there's somewhere called Games Room, which is kind of a pub, but it also has loads of pool tables and dartboards and stuff. I feel like if pubs do that instead of just sticking to their roots and trying to stay traditional, especially in urban places with a lot of young people, that will definitely keep them going for sure. I was going to say something about regulations actually. So there was the prohibition, right, in the USA at some point where they banned alcohol,
Yes.
like back in the day.
Yeah. That happened.
And I was wondering if the UK has had anything similar.
I mean, governments over the centuries have tried to ban. They tried to ban gin. They regulated gin, and it never worked. Thing about humans, they will always find a way to have an alcoholic drink if they want to find a way. I mean, or illegal drugs. If they want them, they will find them. And what happens if you ban something? Then what goes in its place is organised crime or criminality, because they'll be, under the counter, or there'll be dodgy, drug dealers. They'll be in America during Prohibition. That's when the mafia started. Organised crime, the mafia started because they were bootlegging. That was like, supplying illegal alcohol. Or there'll be smuggling. So there'll always be this effect that the government or the regulators didn't want. Various governments over the centuries in this company have tried to ban alcohol, or they've tried to regulate it, or they've tried to ban people going to the pubs, or they've tried to regulate them or do things, and it has never worked. So in this country, during World War One, the government insisted that the alcohol level was dropped in beer. And I keep going back to beer, but that was everybody's drink. Beer has always been everybody's drink, by the way. That was the biggest selling type of thing, and it's what kept the pubs running, the beer. So they needed the alcohol level dropping, and one reason for that was because they needed less malt to be used to make the beer. Now, if you use less malt, that's your source of sugar. So if you have less malt to begin with, you have less potential sugar, and that means that the alcohol level is going to be lower, because the alcohol level is related to the amount of sugar that the yeast has eaten during fermentation. So you've got less sugar to begin with because you've got reduced malt. Therefore, your beer is going to be lower alcohol. So they wanted it to be around 2%, maybe 3%. And so after World War One, brewers were in the habit of brewing these lower alcohol beers. Now, even now, you go to the pub, you get a 3.5 beer, Green King IPA, which is not a modern IPA, it's a really old-fashioned style of IPA. It's 3.5 or 3.6. So that never got up to its pre-World War One strength. People had got used to it. And they're called session beers. When they're low alcohol like that, you can drink a few in one session and not fall over because you've got lower alcohol. So that was one intervention during the war, World War One, which didn't really have a bad effect. It was quite a good effect, actually. Another reason for that, it was because a lot of people who were working in armament factories, making weapons for the war effort, if they went to the pub the night before and drank loads of strong beer, they might be hungover, or they would be hungover the next day if they'd had a few. And so they'd be at work and they'd be like, not effective or not working as productively, or they might have an accident because they've got a bad hangover. So that was another reason. And then what they also did, they changed the licensing laws for when the pubs could be open. And the pubs used to be open for many, many more hours pre-World War One than they are now, actually. And so the licensing laws were changed, and I think it was something like they opened at 12, and they could stay open until either 2 or 3. Then they closed, and then they opened at 6, and they stayed up until 10. And so that was to reduce the amount of beer that was being drunk, because the malt, by the way, is food, and if you're in war, if you're in times of war, you can't have all that barley, which is food for the animals. It was food for horses that were in the trenches. It was, they needed that barley. So that was another reason, by the way, about, the supply of the barley. But the pub opening hours were quite restricted. And I think it was only in the mid-90s that they were relaxed, those rules.
Wow.
I remember in the 90s and 80s, I used to go to the pubs in the 70s, 80s. It's really annoying. You'd be out Saturday, you think, I'll go out at lunchtime, I'll have a few drinks. And then you'd be chucked out at 3 o'clock. There was nowhere else to go to until they opened at 5:30. They changed from 6:30. And so you had 2.5 hours of like, what am I going to do now? If you're a student.
Yeah.
And it's weekend, it's like, no, I just want to go out with my friends. That was horrible. And then in the mid-90s, they changed the law. And so pubs could be open all day. And in fact, pubs have the option to have a 24-hour license now.
Wow.
So that World War One regulation only changed fully or was relaxed completely in the mid-90s. Something else that the government did as well after the war, World War One. Oh no, during the World War One, the government actually nationalised some pubs. I know, it's hard to believe, isn't it, that the government would own pubs. And they nationalised pubs in Carlisle and Enfield in North London because they were right next to big armament factories.
Oh.
And so by nationalising them, could sort of control them and because they need the workers in the factories to be going to the factory and not drinking all the time. And so that was one thing that, nationalised. And then in the 20s, the government decided that they wanted pubs to be more family friendly and not just drinking dens for men. So they tried to encourage pub building, to have family rooms or to have rooms where children could go, and to have entertainment that wasn't just around drinking, to have more food, to have food that families could eat together. So they weren't just boozy pit. And so that's why you see a lot of pubs in the date from about the 1920s. That period, by the way, architecturally, that period was known as Brewers Tudor, as in Elizabeth I. So you'll see a lot of pubs that have Tudor architecture on them. And that that they were built in the 1920s in this style, because that was really fashionable at the time. But also this new pub building was building bigger pubs with rooms for families, with what we call snugs, where women might go because they didn't want to be with the fellas who were swearing and spitting and smoking, in the bar room. So all these different rooms would be for different people and different drinking occasions or different purposes for drinking. And it's called either Brewer's Tudor or Mock Tudor, that sort of thing. So, and
Yeah.
they were on places like the outskirts of towns where there were big intersections. People were buying cars and they were going out for days out, and they were going for exploring the country, and they're like, where we're going to have lunch? Oh, let's go to that pub. And it's on an intersection or a roundabout of a road. So this all dated from the 1920s, and this was all about improving pubs and changing them from just being boozy places to being something that the family could enjoy as well.
Well, that's literally an example of what we were talking about in the present day. That's an example of pubs adapting to the changing technologies and the changing times. So hopefully pubs nowadays can also adapt to what's changing now and what will change in the future. I was going to actually touch on about 0% alcohol. What do you think about non-alcoholic drinks that are, yeah?
Well, I really like non-alcoholic beers, and I think they're fantastic. Of all the non-alcohol versions of alcoholic drinks, I think beer gives the impression the most that you are drinking beer. You don't even need the alcohol. You get that taste of beer, you get the buzz. It looks, smells, tastes like beer. So I think they're fantastic. I'm a judge. I'm the beer and cider judge at the World Alcohol Free Awards. And I also get to taste wines and non-alcohol spirit, adult non-alcoholic drinks, like sparkling tea, which could be, they're in a champagne bottle. So, and it's got tannins, and you feel you're drinking a really grown-up drink out of a lovely 75 centilitre champagne bottle, pops the cork. It feels grown up. I think they're really good. And also, what you were just saying earlier, that pubs needing to adapt to what's happening in culture now, they need to really up the game on the non-alcoholic version, on the non-alcohol options. Because so many pubs, you go in, it's like, oh, do you have anything non-alcoholic? Oh, we've got a J2O, we've got a, an orange juice. Well, that's the child's drink. Well,
Yeah.
we've got cola, we've got carbonated drink. They're baby drinks.
I still drink Coke in pubs. It's my favorite. I love a pub
Well,
Coke.
sorry, I'll take it back then. What I just, like
No.
people who want to think, oh, my friends are having an alcoholic drink. I'm not, but I'd like to feel as though I'm having something
Yeah.
special. So, yeah, pubs, please up your game. It's really good for business as well, because people will stay longer and they'll spend more money while they're there. And also the atmosphere is quite often better. There isn't as much lariness.
Yeah.
I'm not saying don't have alcohol at all, but mixing in people who aren't drinking alcohol just somehow changes the atmosphere slightly without ruining the atmosphere at all. I mean, things like villages or the countryside. If you have to drive there, if you have to drive in your car, then you can't have a drink of alcohol. So if you fancy a beer and they've got a non-alcohol beer on, then you can be driving your car, but you can have a nice beer while you get to the pub and have a lunch and, go for a drive round and still enjoy yourself and feel as though you're visiting the pub and having a good time. If people go to the pub, they're driving a car, for instance, or a vehicle, and they've gone to a country pub or they're having a wander round and they're driving, and they can still have a drink and still be in the pub. And so without those non-alcoholic drinks, that person wouldn't have gone to the pub necessarily.
Yeah.
And they might have chosen to have lunch somewhere else. They might have gone to a cafe or a restaurant. It's like, oh no, I quite fancy a pub lunch. Great, they've got some good non-alcohol drink. I'll have those. See, they're spending more money, so it makes sense for the publican to have a good selection.
Do you think the alcohol industry are adapting quick enough, or do you think they think it's a threat to their business?
They are adapting if they can afford to do that. So smaller brands might not be able to adapt. The reason for that, to de-alcoholize your drink, it's expensive. To get the best non-alcohol drinks that are versions of your alcoholic drink, it's really expensive. You need a really high tech filter or a vacuum distillation. So there is an expensive extra step that some small brands can't afford. But the bigger brands, they're already adapting, sure. You've seen it more. For me, what would make a really massive difference is if more non-alcohol beer was available on draft, because then people could drink the beer without the friends knowing that they're not drinking alcohol. Because there's some people, men in particular, it's not all men, but there are some men who laugh if the friends want to have a non-alcohol drink.
Yes.
So the ones who do want no alcohol, they can then go to the bar, order the beers, they get the round in, they order themselves a non-alcohol one, comes in a pint, looks exactly like beer. The friends don't know they're not drinking beer.
Sneaky.
The alcohol beer, exactly, sneaky. So that would be amazing. If we could get more non-alcohol beers on draft, fantastic.
What do you think about that peer pressure? Because I don't actually drink. I probably drink once or twice a year. And I've definitely experienced that kind of peer pressure and encouragement. Like, oh, you're not drinking tonight. Why are you not drinking? Why do you think that's the case? Why is there such a prevalence of that peer pressure?
It's sometimes because if you're in a group of friends, you want to be together doing the same thing in that group. And somehow the perception is that the person who isn't drinking is no longer in that group, that they're slightly disconnected from it. So there's that. There's also, sometimes people don't trust people not drinking. It's really odd, isn't it?
Really? Yeah.
It's like, why
in what way?
It's like, oh, well, they're not drinking. I'm drinking. I might get a bit out of it. And they'll know, they'll be judging me or whatever.
Oh, I never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That. Also, tends to be men that do it more than women.
Yeah.
But, some women do. What's really annoying is if people question you. They shouldn't question. It's like, you don't have to have a reason why you're not drinking.
Yeah. I just say to them, like, why are you drinking? I mean, like, yeah. It's really interesting. I think maybe also because it's so embedded in English culture as well, maybe, especially when you're growing up as teenagers or students. So, yeah, you're seen as out of place or different, and it gets a bit tribal.
Yeah, tribal. That's a good way of putting it. So, yes. Yeah. I think it's getting better, certainly in maybe an older generation. I think people are a bit more like, oh, okay. And they don't even question it because they know that some people might be running a marathon or they're training or they know the reason for them not drinking, or they know that the person gets a headache when they drink alcohol, or that they're working early the next morning. They know the reason, they're not questioning it. Well, why aren't you? People shouldn't do that, I don't think.
Maybe it's a maturity thing as well. Like you said, as people get older, they are more understanding. Speaking about marathons and stuff, I read somewhere that the World Health Organization guidelines say no amount of alcohol is safe. Do you think alcohol can ever truly be healthy, or is it wishful thinking?
Well, it's one of these that some medical studies will say a minimum amount of alcohol does give you some benefits, some health benefits. There are caveats to that. It's the strength of the alcohol, it's your underlying health, your underlying health in general, whether you smoke cigarettes or not. So there are caveats. I think the World Health Organization sort of do a blanket coverage, because if you're drinking spirits, then if you drink spirits a lot, that's not good for you. I mean, one little spirit every now and again, there are benefits to the ethanol alcohol. But if you're drinking a low alcohol beer that's got all that nutrition, all the polyphenols, all the antioxidants, all those benefits that you get from a fermented alcoholic drink that's lowish alcohol, then as long as you don't drink every day, this is a really interesting subject, actually, because some people say, oh, no, it's fine if you don't drink every day and if you drink in moderation. I've done quite a lot of research into this, actually, or reading up about it. And I'm of the small amount, just every now and again, but just be aware that overindulging in alcohol can affect your health badly. I think that's probably the way to look at it. There's a saying, and it's like, get the most out of alcohol, don't let it get the most out of you. So
Yeah.
it's just being aware of, yes, that alcohol in excess can cause problems. And another thing as well, everybody's different. We all have a different physiology.
Yeah.
Our bodies deal with alcohol differently to that person next to us. So, these blanket statements it's not everybody that, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I think you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. It might be an overgeneralization, and it's contextual and specific to the person, depending on their lifestyle and health factors, etc. So if you have, say, a beer before dinner and then you have a wine with your dinner every day, do you think there's health implications to that? Is that too much?
Yeah, I think probably drinking every day, probably not. Maybe every other day, or 3 days a week, maybe. Depends on the person, really. Depends on the
Yeah.
person, the lifestyle, their age. There's all sorts of factors. I try to drink. I drink less and less nowadays. But even when I was drinking more, I would restrict, and I put in my diary that I had a drink that day. And because I work in the alcoholic drinks business, this was particularly pre-pandemic, when I went out a lot more with clients, and there was a lot more going on in terms of pubs and alcohol. I'd be really strict, and I'd have 3 days of a week drinking, and I'd have 4 off. And then sometimes I'd have 2 weeks off. So I was just really, really conscious and aware.
Yeah. I think that's probably the best approach, really.
Also, I always want it to be a treat. If you have something too often, it just becomes commonplace. I always want to feel as though I'm having a treat when I have an alcoholic drink.
I guess, yeah, it's relating back to the pleasure response, the dopaminergic response. If you have it too much and not in moderation, that pleasure feeling will kind of dip down. But if you have it, like you said, every so often as a treat, you're going to keep getting that reward system. But I guess that's what makes it addictive in a way as well for a lot of people.
Yeah. Anything that gives us that lovely brain chemistry is addictive, isn't it? People get addicted to gambling because you get that sort of, that thrill and that spike in your brain. So anything that makes us happy in our brains can be addictive.
Yeah.
I think, the thing to do is to be aware of those addictions and be aware of the power of whatever your addiction is, and try and be stronger than it, I guess.
Yeah. Mitigation. You said, touched briefly about potential health benefits of things like of alcohol or beer. Could you go into a bit more detail about some of the healthy things in these drinks?
Yes. So ethanol alcohol is the alcohol in that we consume, recreationally, and in small amount, it can help to build up or create good cholesterol. And if you have the good cholesterol, then there is less likely, or it can mitigate against heart disease and type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure. But it has to be in a minimum amount, because if it's in excess, it has the opposite effect. So that's the alcohol itself. Antioxidants are compounds that you get through fermentation. Antioxidants can help to mitigate the effects of something called free radicals, which are molecules that can cause cancer or aging or all sorts of illnesses and inflammation. There's polyphenols, which are really good, and they can help, in certain ways, and support antioxidants and things like that. I'm just going to tell you, beer is full of vitamin B, particularly. It's got minerals and vitamins, but particularly B vitamins. And B vitamins are very important in so many parts of our health, to supporting different areas of our bodies and overall health. Brewer's yeast. So brewer's yeast is what winemakers, beer makers, cider makers, most and bread makers as well, by the way. It's a strain of yeast that can be made into tablets called brewer's yeast tablets. And brewer's yeast, I take them, by the way, brewer's yeast, and it's in the beer as well, and it's in the drink if it's been made with this particular strain of yeast. Then brewer's yeast is really good for, it's good to help stop onset of type 2 diabetes, but also brewer's yeast is full of goodness and protein and all sorts of lovely things. So if you take the tablets as well, healthy.
Yeah.
Gosh, there's all sorts. So vitamin C, for instance, if you're drinking cider, cider was used on ships when scurvy, that's a disease that you get if you have a really bad diet and you don't have vitamin C. Terrible, it kills people. In fact, it killed more mariners. Scurvy killed more mariners than all the wars and all the diseases and all the everything else put together. It was an absolute killer. Because, the sailors were away for months. I'm talking about until about the 19th century. They were away for months, no vitamin C, nothing fresh, and so they got scurvy. Terrible, terrible, terrible. But then it was discovered that cider was a really good way of preventing it. This is before they realised that lime juice or lemon or citrus would be a really good thing, vitamin C. So cider was used. So a lot of mariners would drink cider on the ship. Again, it's medicine.
Yeah. Is that because the apples in the cider is high? Are they high in vitamin C?
Yes, the apples are, and because it's been fermented, it's even more. The vitamin C is higher because it's been fermented than it would be if you ate the apple. So eating the apple's good. Drinking the cider even better. Plus, it's soluble as well. Also, cider has something called pectin. Pectin is a compound in apples, and that's a prebiotic, so that's really good for your gut health. In fact, all fermented foods and drinks are good for the health of the gut, and they support the immune system. So I think it's either 70 or 80% of the immune cells in a human body are actually in the gut, and that's why it's so important to keep a healthy gut and to have a balanced diet of whole foods. And keep eating different sorts of things. It's called the biome. So get a really healthy biome in your gut, and you'll have a healthy immune system as well. And alcoholic drinks, particularly the non-distilled ones, are really good for that.
Well, that's why people have stuff like kefir, like fermented things, and kimchi, isn't it? Because, like you said, I assume that as they ferment, it kind of increases the nutritional value of those things and increases the amount of kind of good bacteria for the gut.
That's exactly it. And so those lovely kefirs, kombucha, that's one as well that people drink.
Yeah.
And kimchi and sauerkraut and anything fermented has all those good bacteria in and the the microflora. So, and that's what the fermented drinks do as well.
Yeah. I was going to touch on very famous pub brand in the UK, Wetherspoons. What do you think about Wetherspoons and their business model?
Yeah. Wetherspoons is really good because it has its market. It has a market for people on a budget and people who want to maybe have a family day out. They just want to go for a few drinks and not spend an awful lot. They have this thing called the value. It's not cheap, it's value. Different thing. I think it's really good because it really, people who are on a limited budget can still go to the pub. And also they're in towns, they're in cities. So if you live in an urban area, you can go to Wetherspoons if you want to. There's a myth about Wetherspoons in that the drinks are inexpensive because they're out of date. Not true.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not true. If you were selling an out-of-date drink, then your customers wouldn't stay around for long. So they'd go,
Why are they so cheap then? Is it because I thought it was because they're almost out of date. Is it buying power?
It's buying power. It's because they buy in volume. So, for instance, some Wetherspoons pubs, a lot of them actually, you can buy a pint for £2.50. Well, a third of that is tax. The government take a heck of a lot of tax on beer. But the reason it's £2.50 is because they've bought from massive breweries, and every single one of those Wetherspoons around the country will have that beer in. So they're buying huge volumes, and they can get a lower price on them. So it's to do with
Yeah.
volumes and getting a price from the brewery. You know, some breweries won't give a discount on the beer. So Timothy Taylor's don't, London Pride doesn't, you know, Fuller's, or they didn't used to. So those beers will be higher priced, but you can still get really much more inexpensive drinks because it's volume.
So Wetherspoons leverages economies of scale, not because the drinks are out of date. You've heard it here first.
So they
Yeah,
have, yeah.
I did not. I had no idea. I genuinely thought it was because they're almost out of date. It's really
Yeah.
surprising.
I know it's one of these urban myths about Wetherspoons, which is really unfair because they do take care of what they're selling. You know, no business could survive if you were selling substandard goods. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna also ask you about the School of Booze. What actually is it?
School of Booze is a consultancy. So I do all sorts of consultancy about alcoholic drinks and the non-alcoholic equivalent. I also train people. So I train people in knowledge of beer, cider, wine, spirits. I write, do lots of writing. So I write books. I do corporate events. What else do I do? Oh, things like consultancy of for companies like marketing companies who are they're working for a big brand, for instance, and they want to know what the market is for a certain type of drink, or where the market is at that particular time. Or the brand owner is trying to introduce a new brand or a new style of drink or something, and would I help them with the development of that drink? Or I've done things like glassware design consultancy, because the shape of glassware impacts what you're drinking.
Yeah.
So certain brands will want their own branded glass, but it has to enhance what's in the glass. Has to enhance that, but it also has to feel good in the hand. It has to look good. So that's all to do with the design of glassware. So I've done that. So yeah, I've done loads of things. It just depends what the client wants. You know, if it's to do with alcohol or the non-alcoholic equivalent, then I've got loads of different knowledge and things I can help them with.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a very interesting kind of career. It means it sounds like you're doing different things all the time. Definitely keeps it from not being boring.
Yeah.
Jane Peyton, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely, really, really love this conversation. I've learned so much, many myths busted, and a lot of facts learned. Where can people find your work?
Oh, if they just put School of Booze in a search engine, or if they want my books, I write non-fiction under my name, Jane Peyton. So if you just go online, that would bring up all my books as well. I've written several about alcoholic drinks and books not about non-alcoholic drinks. And I also write novels under a pen name B.A. Summer, which always
Oh,
they always have a little bit of alcoholic drink, maybe,
of
and a
course.
pub as
Yeah.
well. Always got to have a pub. Oh, just, sorry, I'll say this quickly, but there's a reason that
Yeah.
every soap opera on television in Britain has a pub at its heart, because A, it's the centre of the community, but it's also where action happens. And if the
Mm.
writers need something to happen where there's groups of people, or that different people are seeing other different people and some action can happen, or the plot can be driven, then that's where it happens, at the pub.
Wow.
The
Well,
Queen
that's how
Bee,
you found out about
Mother of His Return.
drinking and pubs to begin with, wasn't it?
Exactly. Got to thank those soap operas.
Yeah.
English.
Where? What upcoming projects are you working on? If you're writing, are you writing any new books or?
Yeah, I've just finished one. I'm going to do a series called Knowledge Box. And so I've just finished their Knowledge Box. It hasn't been published yet, but it will be fairly soon. And I'm going to do an audio version of that as well, actually. So the Knowledge Box, the idea of the books, it'll be a series: beer, cider, wine. I might do gin. I haven't decided yet, but certainly beer, cider, and wine. And it's knowledge that people want to know to give them this really good understanding of what they're drinking. History, how to match with food, how it's made, different styles, glassware. everything that you want to know. So if you're doing an accreditation in that particular subject, it's really, really helpful. But even if you're not doing an accreditation, just really useful knowledge to have. And it's written in a way that's very accessible and easy to understand. So I've finished Beer Knowledge Box, and I'm just editing the Cider Knowledge Box as well. So that both of them will be out in either a month or 6 weeks, hopefully.
Brilliant. Well, I'll be sure to leave links to your work, and just let me know when the work comes out, and I'll try and help you promote it. Sounds really, really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. That's kind of you. Well, I hope your listeners and viewers have enjoyed the conversation. It's been really good to talk to you. It's been very wide-ranging, and I've really enjoyed your questions. They've been fantastic questions, actually. So thank you.
No worries. No, I thank you too. Really enjoyed it, and hopefully have you come back on the show in the near future.
Okay. Well, all the best to you and to your viewers as well and listeners.